Here we go. Right. Okay, well, thank you very much, Emma, and thank you for asking me to talk to you today. And in fact, I did grow up in Scotland, so it's very nice to be talking to a Scottish audience. But actually, if I look at where I live now, I live here. This is Cornwall, and this is my local beach where I take my dog for a walk every morning. And it is also, unfortunately, the epicenter of a COVID epidemic at the moment, because post G7, I think we've seen a 4,000-fold increase in COVID infections. So we have that unlikely dubious honour at the moment. But you can see the beautiful surroundings that I'm surrounded by. And in fact, it was this relationship with nature and with the sea that has inspired much of my research into marine pollution and ecotoxicology. And if we look at what kind of research I do, I work at the University of Exeter and we run the Ecotoxicology Research Group. And as Emma said to you and introduced very nicely, we cover a number of different research questions. We want to understand how pollution damages living things, not just wildlife and aquatic life, but also human health. I try and understand what makes some species more vulnerable than others. We try and use this knowledge to protect the environment and human health from further harm. So we want to be able to use whatever we have to make the world a better, safer place in the future. We've luckily been quite successful in doing that. And this is our research team. Just over a year ago, this is about 15 months ago at Buckingham Palace, because we were very pleased and surprised to be awarded a Queen's Anniversary Prize for the research into plastics and human health that we do. And you can see us, we're all very pleased with ourselves. The entire team were there. It was a real honour. And here we are meeting Prince Charles and Camilla receiving this medal. And the other reason for showing you this is that just over a week later, we discovered that Prince Charles and Camilla had gone down with COVID. So we nearly came home with more than we bargained for when we went off to London on that day quite a long time ago. But what was it that we were given this award for? And what is it that I'm going to talk to you about today? Well, it's our research into plastics, and in particular, into a kind of plastic that has been interfering with the environment for some time and which has been a highly topical research area, and that is microplastics. So the rest of the talk I'm going to spend telling you a little bit, taking you in a snapshot through tour through some of the research that we've been doing and some of the research questions that we've been addressing. And most of you will have heard of microplastics. Most people's grannies and grandparents have heard of microplastics these days as well. And what we talk about in terms of microplastics are those tiny pieces of plastic that break down from larger items of plastic debris in the environment. And here we can see some images of some of them. We're talking about microfibers on the left that might be released from synthetic clothing and other items. In the center, you can see some microbeads that until recently we added in huge quantities to different consumer items and cosmetics. And on the right, you can see microplastics that have broken down from larger pieces of plastic in the environment. And we've been studying these items and trying to wonder what they do, because when we, in our earlier study of marine pollution, we used to have to filter out all the tiny pieces of plastic from all of the seawater samples that we were studying to make the samples fit to analyse all of the chemicals and the contaminants that we thought would be in there. And it took a while before we realised, well, if these tiny pieces of plastic are everywhere, maybe they're the contaminant, maybe they're the thing that we should be studying. And it started us thinking about where they would be going and what they would be doing. And one of the reasons that microplastics cause concern is because of their size range. As you can see from these diagrams, they're anything from about 50 to 70 microns up to about a millimetre in length. And that size range overlaps, particularly in the aquatic environment, with the size range of the particulates and the prey items that form the food source for many, many diverse different aquatic organisms. It raises the question of whether they are being ingested, and if they are, what they might be doing. So, microplastics, what do we know? Let's take a little snapshot tour through some of the research that we've done over the past few years and see what we now know. So the first question that we asked was whether microplastics, given their size and their overlap with prey items and other particulates, could actually enter the food web. and if so, whether this was a problem. And to study this, we decided to look at organisms that were near the base of the aquatic food web. The organism at the top is called Centropodes typicus, and this is a little copepod. And copepods are planktonic species that live in the surface of the oceans, and they're one of the most abundant species on Earth. And they define food webs. So anything that happens to them can be very important for the function of the oceans. And we found very early on that, in fact, copepods can ingest plastics. They don't seem to have the ability to avoid ingesting them with their food items. And we were able to quantify how much plastic they took in and how it passed through their gut and how long it stayed there. We also used many other model species, as you can see in the diagram at the bottom. This is Crassus triachigus. This is actually a small 3-day-old so-called D-shell larval oyster. And this is a temporary inhabitant of the planktonic communities in the water column where it lives. And we were able to study both the size range and the type of plastic that this filter-feeding bivalve would take into its body. And here you can see we've used fluorescence microscopy to be able to identify tiny nano-sized plastic particles, and where the red circle is the organism's gut. We were also able to show, or we also made the observation, and I'll come back to this in a few slides' time, that it was very obvious that the organisms had been ingesting plastic because we could see them quite readily in the fecal pellets which were excreted by the animals along with their food source. So I'll come back to why that might be significant in a few slides' time. We were also able to use state-of-the-art biomonitoring approaches to be able to understand what else might happen to microplastics, and to show that not only were they ingested by species, common and marine species, but they could also adhere to the outside of the animals' bodies. And in these images, we've used a kind of Raman spectroscopy called hyperspectral imaging, which looks at the vibrations of different bonds in different materials to be able to identify them deep within the tissues. So we don't have to dissect out the organism to be able to image what's happening. And here, as you can see on the image in the top right, we can see small polystyrene microspheres adhered to the gills of the animal. And in the bottom right, we were also able to show that they were adhered and stuck within the gill rakers, or the modified setae, which the animal used to clean its gills. So they can be ingested, but because of the electrostatic and hydrophobic properties of plastics, they can also stick to the outside. And we used the same kind of technology to be able to look inside the stomach of the animal. Now, different kinds of aquatic animals have stomachs of different complexity. Crabs have particularly complex internal structures in their stomachs. And what we were able to show here was tiny pieces of polystyrene microsphere that had become stuck within the shore crab foregut setae. So they were embedded within these setae, and you can see from these images, they're stuck in there. And this seemed to be allowing them to be retained within the body of the crab for quite some time. So much of the plastic that was ingested by the animals would pass straight through, but a significant portion would be retained in the animal's guts. And we then went on to move up the food web from organisms near the base to look at what might happen in other organisms. In the schematic at the top, we were able to show that microplastics were present in higher trophic levels. We studied all 7 protected endangered species of turtle. Turtles are migratory animals, and they move right across the main oceans of the world. And we studied post-mortem turtles which had been beached in sites in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, and in the Pacific Ocean. What we found was that turtles in all of those locations, 100% of the turtles that we studied had plastics in their guts. We were able to compare the results across different species. Some species are herbivorous and some species are carnivorous. And we found plastics of different shapes and forms in the guts of all of these animals. And this was important because it suggests that there may be multiple routes of uptake, both direct uptake and potentially uptake through different food sources through trophic transfer. In the schematic at the bottom, we specifically looked at trophic transfer, and to be able to do this in the natural world is quite difficult in the oceans. And we took advantage of the seal sanctuaries, of which there are several, particularly in the southwest of England. In these seal sanctuaries, seals live in water, which we were able to sample, and they're fed with fish, which we were also able to sample. And because they're captive seals, we were also able to collect their seal scat to look at what they were ingesting out of their bodies. And by doing this, we got a fairly good idea of whether anything that was in the fish was being passed to the seals and then subsequently excreted. And what we found was that we could find plastic in the fish that the seals were eating, and the bar at the top is showing the size and the shape of the plastics that we found in the fish. We were also able to show that the seals were excreting plastic in their seal scat, suggesting that the plastics had passed through the animals. But interestingly, the size and the shape and the nature of the plastic that was excreted was different from the plastic that was being ingested. More fibres were ingested from the fish than were being excreted by the animals. And although we can't prove this from this particular experiment, it suggested that certain shapes and sizes of plastic were in fact being retained in the bodies of the animals. Now, the seals that we studied were on the shores of the UK, which we know is quite highly contaminated, but our research has also taken us further afield. And I'm not sure if any of your the listeners will recognise where this particular image is taken from. But it's taken from one of the most remote locations on Earth. And this is a picture of the Galapagos Islands. We've also been monitoring uptake of plastics into the food web in the Galapagos Islands. Although this looks like a pristine environment, thousands of miles from the nearest habitation, in fact, they have their fair share of plastic contamination on the beaches, which has washed there on the Humboldt Current from the main shores of South America. And in fact, this paper has just very recently been published. Even in the most remote locations, we can find plastic in organisms near the base of the food web. In here, you can see the slightly different marine organisms that we were studying. And we were able to show that microplastics are present both in the sediment, sand, the water, and ingested in the invertebrate marine organisms on the Galapagos Islands. So this is telling us that contamination with microplastics is going on all around the globe. But what harm do they do? Just because they're there doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing any harm. And to be able to persuade policymakers to do anything different in terms of how we use plastics, we really need to be able to show that they're not a good thing to have around, or conversely, to show that they do no harm and it's absolutely fine for them to be there. So many of our studies have examined what happens under near natural environments as much as possible. So in these experiments, in the next few panels of results, we were culturing lugworms in sediments contaminated to varying degrees with different plastic particles. And we were culturing them in the aquarium for up to 1 month and then determining what effect there might be to the organisms of living in a plastic contaminated environment. And what we were able to show, and what we've since shown and others have shown in many, many different experiments, is that the presence of plastic causes animals to do less well. They put on less weight, they grow less well, and because of that, many organisms then go on to reproduce less well, because particularly in small aquatic organisms, the rate of growth is closely tied to the reproductive rate. So we found that the more plastic that we added, the less energy reserves, and particularly the less lipid the lugworms were able to gain. Now, you might say that this is just because we've replaced some of their nutritious food in the sediment with inert plastic particles. But we repeated the experiments using inert quartz sand instead of plastic particles in an equal weight volume. And we found that we saw no effects. And we've seen this several times, or many times in our experiments, that there seems to be something particular about plastic that causes the animals to put on less weight, potentially because the plastics are being retained for longer in the gut, and therefore displacing organic nutritious material. We were also able to investigate what might happen in terms of what the plastics might have in them, because as many of you will be aware, plastics aren't just inert polymers, but to give them all of their different functions and the softness, the colour, the plasticity that many of them have, we add additives. And one of the additives that is added to many, many different plastics are phthalates. And phthalates are plasticizers, which have been linked to a number of adverse health conditions in human and wildlife populations. And what you can see in this experiment is that we were able to show that phthalates that were present within the PVC particles that we exposed the worms to in the previous 1 month setup were able to pass from the particles into the bodies of the worms when the sediments were contaminated with those particles. And we were also interested to know what would happen to exogenous contaminants, things that were present in the water column. One of the issues with plastics is that they have a nice hydrophobic surface that tends to attract different contaminants from the water column. And one of the theories is that those contaminants might then be able to pass from the water column, accumulate on the plastic material, and then be transferred into body tissues. In these experiments, we were using a different kind of microplastic. We were using used cigarette butts. So we had a great time going around the various smokers in the department, asking them to donate their used cigarette butts in special paper bags so that we could collect up the cellulose acetate from the cigarette butts and use it for our experiments. And in these particular experiments, you can see that the cellulose acetate microfibers that were present in the cigarette butts when they were used to seed different sediments were able to affect both the physiology of the worms that were exposed in terms of their burrowing time. So that you can see that the burrowing time, which is very important to worms in terms of their survival, was greatly elevated. And also that this occurred at the same rate as the uptake of the nicotine that was present in the smoked cigarette butts. So in short, microplastics are able to transfer both endogenous and exogenous contaminants into bodies and cause adverse effects. And lastly, in this particular panel of results, what about the ecological consequences of microplastics ingestion? Well, if you remember back to that slide earlier on, I talked about the presence of microplastics present in the fecal pellets of zooplankton. And as many of you will be aware, sinking fecal pellet material from zooplankton is particularly important in terms of the biological pump that is present in the ocean and which pulls sinking carbon materials down into the deep depths of the ocean. So this is an important mediator of carbon, and it's where a great deal of the carbon in the atmosphere ends up being locked away down in the bottom of the ocean. And what we were able to show was not only was the plastic present in the fecal pellets of zooplankton, but if it was present at high enough concentrations, it would change the density and therefore the sinking rate of those fecal pellets. You can see on the panel on the left that copepod fecal pellets with polystyrene in them, in the bar at the bottom, were significantly more buoyant than fecal pellets that did not have plastic in them. And they were also more likely to fall apart. So this implies that if you were in an area where the ratio of zooplankton to plastic reached a certain level, then you might impede the function of the biological pump pulling carbon away from the ocean surface. Okay, well, a lot of people ask me, well, are humans exposed to microplastics? You've done a great deal of work showing how plastics enter the aquatic food web, but what actually happens in terms of human exposure? And here are a few results that have attempted to do that. This is a paper from colleagues Van Kouwenberg and Janssen, who looked for the presence of microplastics in bivalves which had been cultured for human consumption. In the graph at the top, we can see Mytilus edulis, the common edible blue mussel. And in the graph at the bottom, you can see Crassus triagigas, the edible oyster. And in both of these graphs, we can see that the authors were able to find the presence of microplastic quite readily in the tissues of the animals. And there are some pictures of those microplastics in the graphs on the right. And they came up with the figure that for an average person who was eating a diet rich in shellfish, perhaps eating a bowl of shellfish once a week, they might expect to consume up to 11,000 particles of plastic per year from the seafood that they were eating. And this is quite a well-known figure, and it led to a great deal of interest in trying to determine exactly how much plastic there was and whether human beings were ingesting it or not. And it's certainly true that if humans are ingesting microplastic, it could enter their bodies. And there is, in fact, a way of doing that. Because if you look at the gut epithelium, all vertebrates have a special area called a microfold cell or an M cell, which has a particularly thin surface and has been modified to allow particles to pass across the surface and into the body. This is primarily to do with ingestion of particles from food substances, and it allows particles to pass into the lymph and the blood vessels. And certainly experiments have used plastic microspheres to show that this pathway does work in terms of humans, primarily ingesting particles of nanometer size, but also up to about 100 micrometers in size. But does this happen in humans? And one of the reasons that we haven't really known until particularly recently whether this happens is that we needed the methods to be able to study that. And here is a result from colleagues at the University of Vienna from 2019, where they went back to the same kind of approach that we took with the seals in the seal sanctuary. It's not terribly easy to take out the stomach of a human being and to determine how much plastic is in there, but it's easy enough to ask people to collect stool samples and see what they're excreting, with the idea that you will at least know what's passed through their bodies. Now, this is a small study. It only had 8 people in it, but it's one of the earliest studies to report that, in fact, plastics can be present in human stool samples. We can see that in this particular example, 100% of the people who took part in the study were passing plastic particles out in their stool, with an average size of about 50 to 500 microns, very similar in size and appearance to the particles that were present in the seal scat. The plastics were very similar kinds of plastics to the plastics we find in the marine environment, and they were primarily polypropylene and polyethylene terephthalate, and these are the kinds of plastics that are used in food packaging. So it wasn't possible to say exactly where these plastics were coming from, but they're certainly likely to be linked to the food that people are eating. To pass on to some more recent results, this is a paper that came from Ibrahim et al. Earlier on in the year, in a paper from Iran. And this is a study of human coloectomy samples. So this is actually taking samples from the colon wall and examining what kinds of microplastics might be present within the body tissues. And again, 100% of the people who took part in this study, and there were only 11 people, so it's a relatively small study, but it's still quite important, had microplastics in their tissues. And the average was about 28 particles per gram of tissue. And that's about 10-fold higher than the amount that was found in the stool samples in the earlier paper. 96% of these were fibers. Again, these fibers are very similar in dimension. These are slightly larger than the fibers that were found in the seal scat. And in this case, polycarbonate and polyamide and polypropylene are the most widely found types of plastic. Polyamide present in a large number of synthetic textiles, as is polypropylene, found in artificial carpets. Polycarbonate widely used for food packaging. But does it actually matter? Well, it's not really possible yet for anybody to say how much it matters and what it might be doing to human health. We looked earlier at the microplastics that were present in bivalves cultured for human consumption, and we saw that an estimate had suggested that the average person consumes about 11,000 particles per year from seafood. That's equivalent to about 7 micrograms of plastic. So if we were only looking at what contaminants might pass from the plastic into human bodies based on that amount of microplastic, we can see that if we're looking at the total PCBs, so polychlorinated bipheноls, are priority pollutants, one of the toxic things in the environment that we're particularly worried about and don't want to see increasing in the human population, that amount of plastic would only increase the PCB exposure of humans by about 0.2%. because PCBs are present in water, they're present widely in different food substances, and they're present ubiquitously. So our other sources of PCB are also present. At present, as you can see from the graphs on the right, there are a number of priority pollutants that are present. Even if we go back to seafood and look at seafood as a source, chlorinated hydrocarbons, DDT as a pesticide, mercury, PBDEs, which are flame retardants, and PCBs. All of these things are widely present in seafood, albeit at low concentrations. And we really don't know yet what the significance of the micro and nanoplastics is. So I'll leave that open to you. Okay, but why don't we do things differently? And I want to spend just the rest of the talk covering a few of the things that we've been doing to try and create a different system and to try and reduce the amount of plastic in the environment. This is important not just from the point of view of contamination, but also from the point of view of climate change, because plastics, which you may or may not be aware, are major sources of global greenhouse emissions. The whole plastic industry produces a huge amount of global greenhouse gases. And if we look at this graph, we can see that currently the plastics industry produces about the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as 189 coal plants. But even though we're all aware and interested in plastics, you may not be aware that the amount that we consume is growing at a phenomenal rate, 10% a year. If we don't do anything about that, by 2050, the plastics industry will be producing the same amount of greenhouse gas as 615 coal plants. Can't really go on. But luckily, there is something that we can do to save the world, as they say, and that's the circular economy. According to the circular economy, we can design things to be different. We only have so much plastic in the environment because that's the way we've designed things. The circular economy seeks to design out waste and pollution. It seeks to keep materials and products in use for longer and to regenerate natural systems in doing so. So, for instance, it wants to reduce, reuse, recycle, replace, and repair. And that stands for plastics, as it does for many other of the products that we use in everyday life. And the good news is that if we were to circularize the plastics industry, not only would we reduce plastic waste, but we would also decarbonize the system. These are some estimates from colleagues at the University of Santa Barbara. In the column on the left, we can see that if we go on producing more and more plastic every year, then the amount of greenhouse gases associated with these plastics will go on increasing. But if we look at the graph on the right, this is a circular system. This is what the greenhouse gas emissions of the plastic industry would look like if we switched to renewable energy, if we used bio-based feedstocks instead of petroleum products to make our plastics, if we recycled plastics and if we reused things instead. So by a combination of different effects, we could both reduce the amount of plastic in the environment and reduce its carbon footprint. And that brings me on to my last few slides. And I just wanted to tell you about the Exemplar Project. And this is a multidisciplinary project which we've been running in the southwest of England. And it is set to try and design a circular economy for plastics using the southwest of England as a kind of a design experiment to see what would work on a regional scale and what might be upscaled to a higher area. And we've got a whole range of different disciplines, ecologists and engineers, we've got polymer scientists, we've got social scientists, and we've got local companies all working together on this project together. And what we've been trying to do is do things like this. We've been trying to work out, well, where does all the plastic that flows through the system in the southwest come from? And we can see in these diagrams that the vast majority of the plastic that's disposed of in the southwest comes through household domestic waste. Yes, we get some from agriculture and fishing gear, but the vast majority is from household domestic waste. If we look at what happens to it, then the vast amount of that waste ends up in landfill or it's incinerated. Yep, some of it leaks directly into the environment, but the vast majority goes to landfill, from where it can then leak into the environment. So this kind of research helps us to identify what it is we should be focusing our efforts at changing. And so the majority of what we've been doing in the project has been looking at the problem of plastic bottles, and its impact and what the various solutions to that problem might be. And we've been taking part in things like life cycle modelling, human health evidence synthesis, and ecotoxicology research. So we've been all working together, which I would advocate is the only way that we can try to tackle the plastic problem in the future. And I'll show you just a couple of the results from that research to give you a feel for what we've been doing. And these are some results from the life cycle analysis. And this is looking at what would happen if you took all of those plastic bottles in the southwest of England and you replaced them with glass bottles. So what would happen to the greenhouse gas emissions associated with their use? And here we've got 3 bars on the graph. On the graph on the left, this is the greenhouse gas emissions from the current polyethylene terephthalate, or PET, plastic bottles that we use at present. Now, if we were to replace all of them with glass bottles, you can see what would happen to the greenhouse gas emissions in the bar in the centre. They would more than double. So that doesn't sound like a good alternative. But if we were to redesign those glass bottles to be half as heavy, so we just make them thinner, so they're not as heavy as the ones that we use at the moment, then the greenhouse gas emissions go back down again. So by using thinner plastic bottles, we would get rid of all of the plastic that we're using and we wouldn't increase the greenhouse gas emissions. So that helps us to sort of determine what solutions might be worth taking. But what about if we were to replace the plastic bottles with a different kind of plastic, something that was more biodegradable, something that was made from waste products, for instance? And this is what we've been doing with Partner Material. These plastic bottles here are made from a kind of polymer made from seaweed waste. On the positive side, they're made from a sustainably derived source. They're biodegradable and they decouple plastic from the oil industry, so you could argue that that's a good thing. On the negative side, you can see that they don't yet have the ideal performance that would be good for selling your Coke in, for instance. They've got some way to go on how they look. They're currently more expensive and we don't know what their ecological effects are. So we've been working on what the ecological effects of these alternative plastics might be. And a couple of results just to give you an idea what's been going on. We've been able to show, and these are some LC50 toxicity curves that we've obtained from different aquatic organisms near the base of the food web. We've been able to show that the biopolymers show very low toxicity. They've got the same toxicity as sodium chloride, so you have to add masses of them really to be able to show a toxic effect. They classify as non-toxic, so that's pretty good. We do see a number of different effects. We see growth-promoting effects. These plastics are made out of carrageenan seaweed, and it's perhaps not unsurprising that we see some growth-promoting effects from the release of that nutritious carbon into the water column. So our animals, and these are the results with Artemia brine shrimp, and they're growing better at low concentrations of the plastics. We also see some subtle effects on water chemistry. So what these graphs are showing you is that the pH of the surrounding water tends to vary and change as the plastic polymers degrade into the environment. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem at the moment. At the moment, only 1% of all the plastics that we use are biopolymers, and 99% of chemical plastics like you could see in your Coke bottle. But the 2030 EU target is that 65% of the plastics that we use should be biopolymers by 2030. And if we're using a great deal, then in areas of high concentration of litter, we could still be seeing a problem if we have too much of the biopolymers degrading. So the message there is that just because something's biodegradable doesn't mean we should be throwing it away if we don't need to. We still need to reduce consumption as one of the main things that we do. So that's the end of my journey through some of the research that we're doing. Some of the research gaps for the future are things like creating a better way of doing things. We need new circular economy models. We need to be researching and finding different bio-based materials. We need to be looking at the toxicity of some of the chemical additives that are present in plastics and perhaps reducing them and replacing them. What are the long-term environmental effects of some of the different materials that we're using? Where does it all go, and what can we do to help stop throwing waste away in developing countries? what I was hoping to do was do a little question at the beginning of the lecture about what a sustainable plastic economy means for you, but unfortunately, technically, it wasn't possible to do that. But here are some of the responses that we got from a survey that we conducted with some of our partners in developing countries. What does a sustainable plastic economy mean for them? They were thinking about biodegradables, no waste, reusable products, a circular economy, green chemistry, net zero carbon. So I would ask any of you still listening, what does a sustainable plastic economy mean for you? What do you think you can do as individuals? And how do you think it might help? And perhaps that's the question I'd like you to take away from this lecture. So thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much to everybody in our research team, and here are just a few of them, for all of the research that they've been doing that I've been able to show you here. And I think there may be, if anybody does have any questions, I think Hannah's got a way of being able to feed them back to us. So thank you very much for taking part, everybody. And I leave the I'll pass back to Hannah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tamara, for not only presenting your work with an exotoxicology background. We got a little bit of a medical lesson too, and a little bit of a economics going on in there. So it was a really great, well-rounded talk. And we do have some questions that have already been submitted. So Tamara, you'll be able to read those questions as well. At the top of your screen, you'll be able to wiggle your mouse up there and find the Q&A, hopefully. And you'll be able to read the questions there. I do have a question that I would like to ask before we leap into our audience's question, if that's okay. So a lot of your work has revolved around, marine ecosystems and marine water. I was wondering if there's been any work done on the kind of water that we get through our taps. Are we finding microplastics within just the drinking water in UK or your study sites as well? I wasn't sure if you'd branched into that as well.
Yeah, we've not done any research on drinking water ourselves, but other people have. There have been some sort of quite high publicity papers suggesting that drinking water, but bottled water particularly, has got a lot of microplastics present in it. And the current thinking is that a lot of those microplastics are coming from the lid. As you squeeze open the lid, you actually release microplastics into the water. So yes, there does seem to be microplastic present in the water people drink and the food that people eat. What it does, what its effects are, we don't know. We do know that if you look for plastics additives, everybody has plastics additives.
Crikey, really are everywhere. Okay, so thank you for that. We're going to move on to our audience's questions now. So if any of our audience have a question, please use the Q&A box that is at the bottom of the screen. Or if you're joining us on YouTube, you are more than welcome to use the live chat to submit a question there. We're going to jump into the first question that came in, which was actually quite near the beginning of your talk, Tamara, which is from Graham. And they ask, are there any natural equivalents to microplastics in our seas? So this is right at the beginning when you were talking about all the different sizes, I think.
Well, I guess the natural equivalent would be particulate matter, organic particulate matter, tiny pieces of detritus and biological material that have been ground down by the oceans and wind and tide to the same size. So there are many, many different particulates of a similar size to microplastics in the ocean. I think the thing about microplastics is that they reach a certain size, but they're not biodegradable. So they then stick around and can't easily be broken down further.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, thank you. So our next question is from Jack, asking, do the effect concentrations you've measured with lab studies compare to environmental concentrations of plastics and the substances within plastics causing effects?
Yeah, well, certainly when you study ecotoxicology, everybody likes to do a dose response curve. So you need to know what's happening at fairly high concentrations, and then working out what might happen at lower concentrations. The studies that I showed in relation to lugworms exposed in sediments, we were doing those at concentrations that we had found in the environment. So we were looking at small percentages, really quite tiny percentages of plastic present in the sediment. So we've tried to do that as much as possible. I could have shown you a picture from some of our colleagues in Indonesia of some of the contaminated coastal sediments that they find in those areas, and actually the level of plastic is 1 meter deep. So when we're looking at environmentally relevant concentrations, 1 meter deep plastic on top of the sediment.
Crikey. Yeah, thank you. So moving on to our next question is from Jana, and they ask, do we need to address the problematic recycling infrastructure in the UK that has been seeing a lot of media attention recently before a truly circular economy is possible?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's all very well telling individuals that they've got to recycle things more, but if there's nowhere for it to be recycled, then it really doesn't help. So if I take the southwest of England as an example, we have an incinerator down here, but we'd also like to be able to recycle a lot more of our plastic. But the nearest recycling facility is in Sheffield that we can send it to. So what are you going to do? Stick it all on a lorry and then drive it all up to Sheffield so it can be recycled? And then you've lost the battle of the carbon footprint of what you're sending there. So, and then people say, oh, well, everybody in the southwest is not recycling stuff enough. But you can't just blame it on the individuals. It's got to be, government has got to have the infrastructure in place, but also we've got to push back up the supply chain to the people who are making plastics. It's got to be the people who think it's okay to sell stuff in plastic bottles because somebody else is going to pay for throwing it away. We've got to put the cost back in, make it cheaper to recycle than to throw stuff away. Throwing stuff away has got to be ultimately the most expensive option.
Yes, and absolutely. I think education as well regarding what biodegradable means and how it's different to compostable as well is a difference that I've kind of noticed, that some people, particularly when you're giving like a compostable mug or cup for your coffee, that can't actually go into your recycling. It's not appropriate to put into recycling. So I think infrastructure to actually compost some of these items that require a kind of compostable furnace, you know, it requires a much higher temperature to break down those materials that we see becoming more and more popular at takeaway outlets or whatever. I think there's a disconnect, well, a lack of education regarding what those terms mean and where those actually are meant to go in the bins, and thus we see that actually a lot of material is not going into the right bin at the end of the day by our users actually.
I think there's a lot of greenwashing as well. So a lot of people are saying that their materials are biodegradable, but what they're not saying is, well, it'll take 30 years, but they are biodegradable, you know, in the end. And there aren't enough checks, there aren't enough regulations of what biodegradable actually means. So we really need to shake things up, simplify the system, make it clearer to people what should be done. But that has to be done by the manufacturers. You can't just blame the public.
No, not at all. But we're going to move on to our next question, which is asking, can you explain more about the graph that showed replacing the plastic with glass doubled carbon emissions? Is that single-use plastic or single-use glass or multiple-use glass over what time period?
I would have to double check on the exact figures in that one, but it was for multiple-use glass. So it was trying to replace the single-use plastics with an alternative that could be used again and again. And one of the issues in the southwest of England, which was probably an issue for a lot of Scotland as well, is that most of the greenhouse gas emissions are caused by the transport. So we don't actually make very much plastic there. So a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions are when you're traveling, when you're passing it and putting it in a lorry and driving it around. So the heavier what you're sending around is, the worse it's doing. I hope that answers that question.
We're going to move on to our next question, which is from Jack, asking, is reduced toxicity of bioplastics assessed due to increased degradation of the plastics themselves or because they contain less plasticizers?
Well, we're not entirely sure so far, but all of the plastics that we use are designed to be, they're kind of safer by design. So they're specifically made with biodegradable carbon, and they're specifically made without some of the more toxic additives that can be present in many other plastics. So the reduced toxicity is a result of all of those issues. Certainly, there are other kinds of plastic where the polymer designers are trying to design even normal polyethylene and polypropylene so that they can be made without additives in them by changing the nature of the chains of the polymers that are made. There's a lot of work into trying to reduce some of the more toxic plasticizers. And certainly there's no doubt that a lot of those plasticizers have caused health effects.
Understood. So we're going to move on to our next question, which is asking, are microplastics passing into the circulatory systems of marine organisms and humans? Do we understand the effects if that has been found?
We don't know if they're passing into the circulatory system of humans, but there is a great deal of research that's going on attempting to answer that. A lot of the research in humans is it's taken ages to just build up the methods that are needed to be able to study those samples. Inhalation toxicology of fibers and their presence in the lungs is one of the things that is being studied. And there are a number of projects that have just been funded to try and look at the circulatory system. Certainly in terms of marine animals, we can find plastics in the hemolymph, so the circulatory fluid of the organisms that we study, things like oysters and mussels. You can see plastics circulating. So they do. We don't fully understand the effects yet. We do see some immunological effects. So the presence of those particles can stimulate inflammatory reactions. The smaller the particles, the more they enter different cells and tissues. So as those plastics get tiny, when they're at the nanoscale, we've been able to track them passing into cells and into the subcellular compartments of those cells. Again, the exact nature of what they do, we can't give a full answer yet.
Understood. Right, I was just gonna say, actually that kind of slightly reminded me of a question I thought of earlier when you were talking about the blue mussels and the oysters. So does that also, those results of finding microplastics in the tissues of these organisms, does that also include scallops potentially?
Yes, and I think there are other studies that have looked at scallops.
Yeah. Excellent. I just wanted to check that because I know a lot of people who are very.
What you're having for tea?
Not me personally. I'm a vegetarian who doesn't eat seafood either, so like I don't actually.
I'm allergic to shellfish, so I can't eat them either. So I can make all of these comments without needing to worry.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next question, which is asking, plastic has recently been started to be used in road making material. Although this is good in some terms of reusability and cost, but would you agree that this is just yet another source of micro and nanoplastics?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because you try and be good and reuse different plastics for different things and turn them into a road. What a great idea. But yes, it is a source of micro and nanoplastics. I think there's been some work from colleagues at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Colleague Alice Horton did a study a few years ago where she was finding lots of different little tiny red flecks of plastic in some of the aquatic samples that she was studying. And it took a while to work out what they were, and they were actually bits of red plastic from red road markings that had been put in a local area. So yeah, they do. What's to be done, eh?
I do remember reading a piece about there was a team, maybe a research team at King's University, where they developed a kind of a tire cover that caught the microplastics of the tire breaking down. I think they'd won like a prize for innovation work, but yeah, sources of plastic everywhere. It is mad. Yeah.
I think the key thing is to consume less. The less you use, the less you're likely to cause a problem.
Yeah.
Is there still a possibility for bioplastics to break down into microplastics too? Yes, there is. It depends what kind of bioplastic is a kind of an all-embracing term that includes biodegradable plastics and non-biodegradable plastics. And there's also a kind of bioplastic called oxy-biodegradable. And what this means is that typically they've had metal catalysts added to them so that the metal catalysts will react with UV light and sort of go pew. And that's when you see some of these plastic bags that sort of fragment really quickly into lots of tiny little particles. One of the drawbacks with those kinds of oxy-degradable bioplastics is that they leave microplastics behind. To not do that, the bioplastic has to completely degrade to carbon dioxide and water. So one of the things that polymer scientists are trying to do is to come up with the perfect solution and the perfect polymer that will break down but won't form microplastics as it does so.
Okay, so watch this space for that. We've got one final question. So if any of our audience who are still with us have a question that you would like to ask Tamara right now, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box. Of course, this entire session has been recorded, so if you want to catch up on anything or share this talk with anyone, you'll be able to find it on the MASTS YouTube channel. So our final question that is on the screen right now, before if anyone submits any latecomers, is from Graham, and they ask, how might we reduce microplastic fibers coming from clothing and ropes? We might use natural fibers for producing textiles, but most of those have other problems associated with them. As a sailor, I would not go back to using natural fiber ropes.
Yeah, one of the solutions that's been put forward for fibres in the oceans is to go back to natural fibre rope. So it's good to know that as a sailor, that's not a viable option. Reducing microplastic fibres, there are different textiles engineers who are working on that at the moment, and they're trying to work out, how do you weave fabrics so that fibres don't come off so much? And it's certainly true that it's the first couple of washes that tend to release the vast majority of microfibers from most items. And then after that, they reach a steady state of not losing so many. So some people have suggested, well, we need to put filters on everybody's washing machine so that we pick those fibers up. But other people have pointed out, well, just buy fewer things. Don't buy so much, don't buy so many new things, and then there won't be so many fibers coming off them and being released into the environment. So there are ways that you can change the weave and the textile weave of different fabrics to stop them being so bitty, if that's a scientific word.
Yeah, and again, just going back to the infrastructure of recycling, I think I remember the nearest place that did proper recycling of fishing nets was somewhere like Lithuania, if I remember correctly. It was not in the UK, and actually collecting all of that fishing gear that wasn't usable anymore is incredibly heavy, incredibly expensive to transport, but the only place that it could be recycled, if I remember right, was not in the UK at all.
That's right, yeah.
So that was...
They'd be making them into carpets. I think they're making polypropylene carpets out of some of the recycled fishing nets. But again, I mean, people don't realise that synthetic clothing is a huge source of microplastics. I think people are now aware that plastic bottles are a bad thing, but it's increasingly the case that people wear stuff and they throw it away. And even wet wipes, they'll release microplastics. And the number of wet wipes people use and then just throw away. It's become like you buy it, you wear it once, and then you chuck it away. And we throw millions of bits of clothing away into landfill every year. It's just unbelievable. I don't know why we as a society that think that that's sustainable in any way at all. It just isn't.
Yeah. We do have one final question, which is actually snuck in through the chat on Zoom, which is asking, is there research that has combined microplastic issues with the effects of global warming directly on the lives of animals?
In a small way, yes. I've got one student who's been looking at the effects of microplastics and global warming on Antarctic krill. She worked through the British Antarctic Survey, and she's been trying to do some multi-stressor experiments to determine what happens when you put two stressors together. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the krill did worse when they were under global warming and exposed to microplastics than when neither of those were present. So I think it's important to see that those two studies are part of the same problem. Microplastics are a symptom of global warming. They are a contributor, and they're a symptom of our throwaway society and the excessive consumption that we indulge in that has ended up with the carbon emissions and global warming in the first place. So all of those things are part of the same study, and we need to consider them collectively.
Absolutely, everything is very much interlinked when it comes to human actions. That is all our questions that we have submitted. So that leaves me to say thank you very much, Tamara, for that really interesting talk and for plowing through the questions with me today. This talk has just been given just before what is launched as Plastic Free July. So that is starting tomorrow. This is perfectly timed. And yeah, thank you very much, Tamara, for being today's MASTS webinar presenter.
Thank you very much for asking me, Hannah, and goodbye to everybody. I hope it's sunny up in Scotland. It's sunny down here in Cornwall.
Yeah, it's not too bad today. And I would just like to highlight, we actually have another webinar tomorrow, which is being presented by Marie Russell from Marine Scotland Science. And she is talking about where are the floating microplastics in Scotland's seas. So this is a beautiful segue into tomorrow's talk, which is a one-off. We don't tend to do talks on Thursdays, but it is actually going to be our last webinar from MASTS for the summer before we launch into autumn conference season. So in the chat right now, if you want to join this talk, then the sign up link should have just been copy and pasted into the link. So if you want to join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. UK time for Marie's talk, then please sign up. You'll get a sign up link in that email. It's different to today's sign up link and a different joining link as well. But if you're able to join us, then I hope you can. We will also be having a live Q&A in the session too. So please sign up if you're able to join us. And I hope that we can see you all again very soon.